As someone said, we're all in the same boat, but not everybody is facing the same weather. Some are facing a cyclone, others a terrible storm, and yet others, they still don't know what the full impact is of what they're facing. We are in extraordinary times with the pandemic COVID-19, which has hit the world, which has hit our nation and has hit each of our communities. And so we do want to see our great state rebuilt. We do want to see as many small businesses and families who live their lives throughout so many wonderful communities in Queensland have a bright future that they can not only envision, but have the hope to know they can survive through today. And for those who are still going very much through the toughness of facing the survival of facing the challenges under the COVID-19 restrictions, the loss of their businesses, the loss of their jobs, the impact across not being able to see loved ones who are dear to them, it may seem that light is yet to come. It is vital that as leaders in our community, we're able to step up and meet the needs as much as we can of those who come to us. And I'm sure across the chamber we all hear many of the same stories. And yet every day we will still find yet another aspect of how it's impacted people's lives. And as I said, we might be in the same boat, but some are weathering very different storms or cyclones and how it's impacting them individually. I want to commend the federal government for the economic stimulus packages that they launched, recognising that there was an urgent need to not only help so many individual workers and businesses, but to really underpin our economy. The National Cabinet bringing together the state premiers was an outstanding initiative, also recognising how important it is that we not only have a national response, but we have state responses and local and community responses. As I said, we're all in it together or in the same boat, but not every area is the same. And this, if anything, highlights even more why we need to champion the importance of decentralisation, the importance of resilience and capacity, not only in the manufacturing chain, but in recognising that communities need to have the services they need in that area without having to travel a long way. And at this time we've seen, particularly with our health throughout the rural and regional areas, so potentially devastated if they were to have COVID-19 get into their midst where there are no intensive care beds. There are no intensive care beds. It's times like this we realise, even more so, the importance not just to talk about decentralisation, but to back it up with real fair dinkum services that recognise that if we're going to have people living throughout the state, not just through choice but through the economic necessity of running this state and delivering the jobs and the prosperity, then we've got to start looking at this differently and backing it up with real services that back and support those regional economies, those regional communities. This $4.8 billion appropriation bill that we have before the parliament is quite extraordinary, and we recognise there have been significant impacts on Queensland's bottom line and a need to inject economic assistance into many parts of our economy. But, as our Shadow Treasurer has alluded, where is the detail? And just because we're standing here together championing our state and our communities doesn't mean that we shouldn't bring the scrutiny that's necessary when we're being asked to pass $4.8 billion. And while we do support there being those stimulus measures, being the assistance, there also is a need to ensure that the money has scrutiny, that it does hit the deck, is rolled out as quickly as possible where it's needed, but also rolled out in a way that is appropriate and gets the best bang for our buck. The state LNP, under our leader Deb Freckleton, our deputy leader Tim Mander, early in the piece outlined what we believe were important measures to support the Queensland economy, to help not only in the survival but potentially beyond that into the rebuild, because both are connected. We must help people survive, for those particularly in those times when it's too far ahead for them to see that light. But there is also the need to ensure that those plans are consistent and they do enable that rebuild. I mentioned it before with some of the regional airports, where today There are airlines in this state saying that they won't pay or potentially are going to defer their landing fees that were months overdue, defer them potentially to October, where it threatens the very viability of some of those regional airports, and in turn the underpinning of emergency services, ongoing transport connections today, but that recovery that I was talking about before. And I'd certainly ask the government to ensure that there is a timely recognition and support for our regional airports, not only the Sunshine Coast Airport, I'm talking about throughout Queensland, because it's vital to the survival and to the rebuild and recovery. So $4.8 billion, a few flimsy pages, not a lot of detail. We know there are some programs that have been announced, but there's a lot of black hole in regard to a very, very big appropriation bill before this parliament. And that's why we must have more sittings of parliament to provide the scrutiny, but as I also said before, to help address those very different weather conditions that so many parts of our community are facing. It is concerning that the raid on the public service super that this Labor government undertook was done at a time when they thought there was plenty of money. But as we also know, they're not very good at managing money, but then it's somebody else's money, and that is the Labor way. They always hope that they can tax tax and cover the black holes that they do create. But that is certainly a concern we have in regard to what is the financial status of the books of Queensland, not just in regard to the super, but so many other areas. We have a right to know and to be able to provide that scrutiny, because the Queensland government has also got a responsibility to be able to meet its financial commitments in the same way that they expect all those businesses and families out there to meet theirs. I want to go on and talk about training. I have addressed some aspects of our concerns about the lack of small business packages that are meaningful and provide emergency relief in a timely way. We've addressed the fact that the loans program the government announced closed without any notice and has left a lot of people in limbo, particularly throughout rural and regional Queensland, but everywhere. We also have addressed the fact that there is a need for real fee relief, real relief in a number of areas that the government still hasn't announced. And I've certainly had that feedback from people who are in the devastated tourism industry, where they have, for example, buses, tour buses, where they will be able to recover further down the track. But when you've got 10 buses and you've got 10 registrations, well, you're certainly going to be pulling them off the road and deregistering them. And that has a knock-on when it comes to getting them back on the road if they can again. But I want to talk about training, because there is an opportunity for many workers displaced to transition to other industries that do still have growth and an opportunity and a need. But the training that's required needs to happen now. It needs to be flexible, and it also needs to be TAFE and the private sector. We need both. We champion the need for a strong and highly skilled TAFE sector delivering great services. We also do so with the private sector as well, because you need both. And we won't rebuild the economy unless you do both. There are literally hundreds of apprentices and trainees who have lost their jobs, who have lost their apprenticeship, and who are now in limbo. I commend the federal government for their package to provide assistance, but this state government needs to do more. That money has been allocated for those training and apprenticeship packages already. There is money that's been allocated. That should be going into providing more assistance today to keep those apprentices in work with those businesses that still want to work but simply can't afford to. We want to see them able to help those young people finish their apprenticeships. There's also, as I said, a strong TAFE and a strong private sector, vitally important to rebuilding our economy in Queensland. There is a need to look at the way that the pipeline of payments is made to those training providers, because we need as many of those workers who may not be able to return to some industries for quite some time to have viable pathways now, not further down the track, not months down the track, now. And it can be done. It must be done. And it's urgent to provide that flexibility. But it does require, for example, with the Certificate 3 guarantee, where all your payment for the providers is at the end when the person who's doing the training has got competency, which makes sense in a different economy, is very hard when you can't get placement as part of that package, or that they are not able to actually complete the practical aspect of their training. So I would urge the government not only to pay people a more timely way, and I do recognise there have been moves in the private training sector for them to do that, but to also look at being able to pay some aspects of those courses earlier, particularly where there's a theory involved. But there's an urgent and desperate need for more people, particularly in aged and personal care and disability care. And there have been people who were already in training who now are in limbo, unable to get the placement because of the lockdown in some of those facilities, because of the fact that they can't get their students through training providers in to complete that final aspect of that vital training at a time when we need these workers most. And so I'd say to the government, more needs to be done to step up and do this. This doesn't necessarily need more money. It just needs it being applied more effectively in a timely way with flexibility. So let's champion good training, but it's got to happen now. It's got to be flexible now, and we need to bring both the private and the public sector together now with industry-led and focused training where the jobs are. But for those who have been partway through their training, there is the opportunity now to be able to be flexible to help those businesses support their apprentices and trainees through that time so that they can complete their training and then return into the workforce fully in their own right in the future. So with this $4.8 billion appropriation, let's see some detail. Let's have the scrutiny of a proper parliamentary sitting program, rather than smoke and mirrors of a Premier who you never know, are we sitting next week, oh, we don't know, and it's not based on health advice, it's more on media advice, and say, goodness me, don't come into Parliament. They might ask you some tough questions, like how you're going to spend the $4.8 billion. We've got to have the ability to ask these questions on behalf of our constituents, on behalf of my constituents, on behalf of all Queenslanders, so that they can not only survive whatever storm they're facing, but there is the opportunity of a real future with recovery in the state of Queensland that we all love, that we're proud of and we value, and we want to see as many people come through to the other side.